Firstly, congratulations on your incredibly impressive election victory. How do you think the Labour Party performed at the last general election, given the unreasonably low expectations beforehand?
I've called the outcome a victory before by mistake, because obviously when you're talking about what happened, you can get carried away into thinking it was a victory. It wasn't. Under first past the post rules and the way that it operates, we lost quite clearly. But I think from where the party came from in terms of expectations, as you mentioned, and to where it ended up, I think to all intents and purposes, it sometimes felt like a victory.
Yes.
I think in terms of vindication for those on the left who were saying that actually it was possible that we could achieve a lot more than many people were giving us credit for, I think many people will feel in that sense it was also a victory. But the reality is we lost. The reality is the Conservatives are still in government, they're still enacting austerity, they're still doing everything they were doing before the election, minus a few bits and pieces and some of the more outrageous parts of their manifesto, which has basically now gone to the trash heap of history where it rightly belongs. So I think there were things that we could take away from it that were positive, but clearly at the end of the day, we're not in government, and that's the ultimate litmus test of success. And so there's questions to be asked about why we are where we are still.
It may be too soon to tell, but in terms of the local election result in Norwich South, do you feel that the biggest factor was the national campaign, Jeremy's personal charisma and the manifesto, or do you think a lot of that had to do with it being a Remain constituency and you making clear that you were voting against us leaving the EU?
Proper politician's answer, hedge my bets. I think it was a combination of all of them.
Yes.
This is probably one of the most complex elections that I've come across, say that I was involved with. I think, compared to 2015, this felt very complicated. I think the outcome in Norwich South is down to a number of factors. I think the fact that Jeremy Corbyn inspired people who haven't voted before, I think that was a factor. I think the paucity of ideas, or definitely the negative ideas within the Conservative manifesto was also part of that. They ran a very bad campaign. I think, as someone said, you couldn't put the Tory election campaign, you couldn't create it in a test tube in a scientific kind of laboratory and come up with a worse campaign, but they managed to do that. They had a very, very bad campaign. But I think it's wrong to say that the Tories simply lost the election and or lost the narrative, lost their impetus, lost their lead, and Labour benefited from that. I think Labour did play a part in the outcome of that election. They closed the polls in a way which no one expected. And I think one of the reasons for that was the manifesto. I think it was a fantastic manifesto. I think in many ways it was a kind of reset. It was a kind of good, strong, social democratic manifesto, one that I think if you'd been transported from the 1970s into the early 21st century here and now, you wouldn't have felt out of place reading it. But it also talked about things about in the future as well in terms of industrial strategy. I was really proud to have a small part to play in that, talking about climate change and so on and so forth. Ultimately, though, I think in terms of that general election, in Norwich South in particular, I think it was the right thing to do on the referendum. It is a Remain seat, and yes, there are kind of 40% or so of my constituents who are Leavers. But actually the research that we did as a constituency Labour Party in the period between the referendum and the general election, we discovered that the vast majority of people in Norwich South both Leave and Remain, overwhelmingly Remain, but definitely a sizable portion of Leave as well, accepted we were leaving the EU, but in terms of the relationship we had with Europe, wanted the closest possible relationship. Many of the Leavers also wanted to be part of the single market. I think that's where the debate has now moved on to. Do I think that my position had an impact on the local result? Yes, I do. I think even if I'd remained on the shadow cabinet and backed and signed Article 50 throughout both stages of it, I think probably, in all likelihood, I would have won. I just don't think it would have been as big a win as it was. I think that did have an impact for a lot of people. And I also think as well, it's important to think longer term. So a lot of people build up a relationship with a local MP. I know many people say there's some statistics now saying only 6% vote for the local candidate, but that's 6%. When you go down to a tight race, that's the difference between winning and losing. So I think that relationship you build with the electorate, that, you know, listen, I stick to my principles. I said I would do this if this happens, or this doesn't happen. I did it, and I think that was, I think people respect that. So I hope it will have a long-term impact on the constituency.